Hey everybody, this is Anne and welcome back to Painting Big. Today we are going to start talking about OSL, Object Source Lighting. Some people have called it Other Source Lighting because it's not always from an object, at least not visibly. So what this is lighting effects. So when you want to make an object look like it's glowing, when you're painting a model holding a light source, things like that, that is OSL. So we're going to talk about today, we're going to set out some principles of OSL so that you guys can understand what we're talking about when we start to go into the actual painting videos. All right, let's get to it. All right, so here we go. We're going to start with mouseling. We're going to just generally go over some basic principles of OSL. And I'm going to talk about what makes a model suitable for OSL, at least models that are going to make it easier for you. And we're going to talk a bit about kind of an OSL checklist and when OSL looks best. All right, whole bunch of stuff. So first of all, let's just talk about some principles, basic things about light. All right. First of all, the main light is going to move in a linear fashion. So what this means is that you need to figure out where your light source is. In this case, it's very easy for us, right? It's this big globe of fire. And if we can extend a line from the globe of fire, from the torch, anywhere on the model, if we can hit a straight line, then we know that the light is touching that area, right? So the minute I pass the nose here, my brush can't touch the other side of the face, right? So it's going to extend right past the nose. So I use my brush for a lot of this, but I also use my eyes. You can just line up the light source with your eyes and kind of look past it. We can see when we move this around that the tip of the torch, and with a torch, I'll give this a little bit of extra wiggle room because the torch is moving around, right? It gets longer, it gets shorter, it moves. But if you can line up things like the tip of the sword here, you can see if I line it up with the torch here, you can see that I've highlighted that area, right? And the ear here, and the ear here. But if I try to line up the torch with the back of the head here, there is a point where we won't be able to see the light anymore. And that's where this shadow comes in right here. So it's going to move in a linear fashion when you're dealing with the light source itself hitting the parts of the model that it's hitting. We're not talking about backlighting or reflected light at this point. We're going to talk about that more when we talk about shadows, and that's going to be the next video. But this one's all about just your main light source, which is mostly what most of us think of anyway, right? When we learn this stuff, it's a very simplified form. So as you can see then, I'm moving this around and I'm kind of judging, okay, the skirt of the armor, I can see that right past this light, so that part of it's going to be hit, things like that. You can pretty much extrapolate. Like I said with a torch, you can do roughly where it should be, and it'll be fine. It'll work fine, right? But anything you can't see from the underside of the pouch here, to the other side of the model here, that is not going to be lit by this light. Second principle is that light falls off. It is most intense close to the source, and as it moves, it's going to fall off and become dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. So let's get closer. The light is very intense on this part of his face, but the fur over here is not as orange as the fur here, right? And the light is intense here, but then it fades a little bit. It's intense right there, but then it fades a little bit. It's intense here, but then it fades a little bit, right? You see what I'm doing? This is a very small model, so you don't have a lot of room to show it on this model, but that's what I'm doing here as I'm moving away from the model. So one of the biggest things that you notice when somebody's trying OSL and they haven't really studied OSL, they're just kind of trying it for the first time. A lot of times they'll give it what my husband calls the paint can effect, where it looks like somebody just splashed a can of paint on the model. It doesn't fade at all. It just there's just a lot of color from the light right on the model. So when you paint it, be aware that light drops off, and it drops off very, very quickly. So it's going to go from really intense, like if his ear was right here, it would be really intense. So it'll go pretty intense, and then it goes, you can still see it, and then it's going to go pretty weak. The reason this picks up over here, and this is an exception to this rule, but metal and other very shiny things will be able to pick up a higher intensity of the light from further away. So on the sword, I'm able to pick up that light just a little bit more. Same with the foot down here. I'm able to pick up a really bright shine, even though it's actually technically pretty far away from the light source. Technically, if I want to be absolutely correct here, I should have faded this out a little bit more. Since it's the same as this, it is farther away, I should have faded this just a little bit more if I wanted to be really correct. But I like the way it looks. And he is a small model, so you can tweak these rules. Like any rule I give you on my channel, rules in art are just guidelines to keep you on the right path at the beginning. You can decide to throw those rules out once you understand what you're doing. And you can make the eye believe what you're doing, even if you're breaking a rule. But first you got to learn the rule, right? So, all right, so next thing. The next rule is the color of the light is going to change the surface it falls upon, right? Okay, so this one is another one, my husband, who is extremely good at OSL, and I'm going to show you a couple of his models in a moment. But this is one he's really picky about. Again, the paint can effect. Sometimes people will just, if it's a green light, they'll just paint the surface green. And they won't pay attention to like the color of the surface otherwise. Like if you're painting a red object and you try to do a green light onto it, it's actually going to go gray. And I'll actually show you an example of this. Complementary colors are weird. So let's take a look at Snake Lady here. Snake Lady's pretty cool. But when yellow light, and I've painted this fireball as if it's really bright. When yellow light hits a purple cloth, it's going to go brown. So that brown transition there, you only get to see the purple when you get to the cool shadows. But her clothing is actually meant to be purple, but only the reflected light picks it up. Only the cool reflected light picks it up. Otherwise, when a yellow light hits a purple object, it's going to go brown. So that's just another complexity, right? So when you do this, let me share a real quick tip with you if you're planning to run off and do an OSL model right after this video. The way to get around this is if you're doing like something like a torch, which is a yellowy orange light, pick colors that work well with yellow and orange. So I did this goblin in my first ever OSL class. It was taught by my now husband. We were not married at the time. He has a great OSL class. His name is David Diamondstone. If you ever go to ReaperCon or KublaCon out here in the Bay Area, then you could take it from him if he's teaching that here. But green is easily highlighted even by an orangey yellow, right? Because it's just going to go yellow-green. Red is going to go orange. Brown is going to go to a kind of a yellowy orangey brown, right? So I chose my colors accordingly so that they would look good when I was working with this light source. This also leads to just a little kind of a footnote, which if you choose a very odd light source like a green or a blue or even a violet, it can really play havoc with some of the colors that you've got. So it can make things harder for you depending on what you're trying to depict. So keep that in mind. Whatever light source color you are using is going to change the color of the area that it hits. And finally, let's bring another guy in. You can see that I've done a fair amount of OSL. All right, this is a funky one because of the positioning, and we'll talk about light positioning in a little bit. Okay, and finally, and this one's a little more complicated. You can probably ignore it a little bit because you probably aren't going to be painting things like this, but the brightness of the light is going to determine how much it affects surfaces close to us and how much it drops off with distance. So a really intense light is really going to wash out surfaces close to it, and it's going to extend farther than you might think as far as distance goes. But this also, in this case, you can kind of use this to imply there's a big difference between the ambient light and the light source. So for him, if you look at him here, he's painted like it's night. He's painted like it's at night. I've done everything very dark that isn't in the light and isn't being touched by the light. And because of that, I want the torch to read as if it's like the only light here. And so it's coming off as very bright. So I painted these surfaces very punchy, very, very bright, to imply that the surrounding area is extremely dark. So I can get away with more light down here. I can get away with more light back here. Obviously, it's a sword, it's reflecting, but still. So that's the theory behind this, and ignore the crystals. We'll talk about them in a minute. All right. So, okay, let me recap. I wish I had like cool text to scroll across the stream, but I am not that high tech. I'm just here for the info. All right. Your main light is going to move linearly. Figure out where your light source is and draw lines to parts of the model in your head to see. If you can put the light source between you and the model and you can see an area on the model, you know that area is in the light. 2, the light drops off quickly as it moves away from its source. Metals and other shinies are exceptions. 3, the color of the light is going to affect the appearance of the colors that it falls on. And 4, the relative brightness of the light determines how much it affects the surfaces close to it and how much it drops off with distance. All right, so now it's time to talk about these crystals. So the easiest way to do OSL is to paint something that is up against a model or against backdrop or scenery. When you have to paint something that's away from the model, that's where it gets complicated, right? That's where you have to start drawing your lines. You have to start, kind of looking at where the light's going to shine. You have to judge how much it's going to fall off. When you're dealing with something like the crystals here, it's much simpler, right? So if I cover up the rest of the model, you can clearly see the glow effect, right? I did decide I wanted this glow effect here just because then this whole area would have been so very dark and kind of boring. I had the opportunity to make these bars crystals, and so I did. But this is the easiest way to do it. If a model has a sword up that they're holding up against their body or against their cape or against their cloth, making that glow. If they've got a gemstone that's, say, in their belt, making that glow, or in their necklace, making that glow. Making eyes glow is another favorite, a fan favorite, right? Like Lava Dragon here. He's got glowy eyes. Let's back up a bit so we can see him. There we go. So you can see the blue glow on the eyes there. You can also see that it is fading off as it goes onto this horn. It fades pretty quickly. And with an object that's a part of the model or that's right up next to the bulk of the model, you don't have to judge angles for the most part, right? You're going to be fading the color out very quickly in general because it's going to be a very small light source. If it's a sword, that's different, right? But in general, you're going to be fading the light out very quickly. You're going to be working against a backdrop, so fading it, you're going to be able to see what it's hitting very easily. And so I feel like this is one of the easier ways to work with OSL. It also has some caveats, which we're going to cover really quick also. This is turning into a long video, so bear with me here, guys. I'll try to be fast. All right, so next principle. OSL looks best when painted onto a model where the ambient light is dim. When you paint a model normally as if it's in sunshine, doing OSL on that model is you trying to sell the illusion that your light source is brighter than the sun. So if you paint a model like it's in normal light, like our Tengu here, if you paint a model like it's in normal light like this, let's say we put a flaming torch or a bright crystal on top of his staff, and you want that to be glowing. What you're telling the viewer is that, because if you make the glow go all down this arm, you are telling the viewer that this light is brighter than the light of the normal day. Sunlight is a very bright thing, and in most cases, it's going to wash out any light that you have in your hand at this distance. It's just not going to show up. You can get away with it in fantasy, maybe some sci-fi, because you've got magical items or items of extreme technology, right? But nonetheless, that is what you're telling the viewer. You're telling them that is so bright that it overpowers the sunlight for you to be able to see it against the model. Now, if you've got an item that's in shadow, say a model that is bending over or otherwise creating a zone of shadow, and you decide to do a light against that, then you can get away with it. So like if this guy was bending over forward and I painted him like he was in sunlight, but I kept this area in shadow, say like our troll here. He doesn't have a light source. He is overhead lighting, but he's not. So let's say he had a doodad on his belt here. I could make that effect glow even though I'm painting him as if he's got overhead light coming, because this area is in shadow. So I can take advantage of that shadow to push a light source here. Otherwise, though, any light source that I tried to give him would be overwhelmed by the overhead light. So can it be done? Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about it. With the dragon, I painted him normally, right? I'm painting him normally. He's not quite done yet. And with him, he's a magical dragon, and he's also, you can kind of feel like he's glowing, right, from within. So I felt that it was fair to give him glow from the eyes. I felt that it would carry, and that it would look okay. As it is, I feel it works all right. I feel it's not amazing, but I feel it works all right, and it serves to bring the eyes out, which otherwise might get lost in all these details. So, not the best case scenario, but it works. I'm going to show you one of my husband's pieces now. It's pretty famous. You should go and look at his website if you want to see more of it. He's got an article on doing OSL on his website. This is The Alchemist. His website is Light Miniatures, Light miniatures.com. And he has a lot of useful articles on there. This is the one for his Alchemist is probably his most viewed article. This model does a couple of things that normally would be very difficult, but it also actually illustrates one of the problems with OSL, which I will talk about in a moment. But because the alchemical fire is supposed to be brighter than the sun, he's able to push it and make it successful, right? So let's get up here. So we see very strong fire on the inside of the hands. It's lighting up the monkey. It's lighting up the bottom of his beard, right? It's lighting up his face. It's even lighting up the underside of the turban. So this is an example where magical fire is strong enough, and he can still paint the rest of the model as if it's in daylight, but it succeeds. Part of why it succeeds is that the model is bending over, right? Just like what I just said. But all of the undersides, and this is the test, right? Look at the model from the direction of the light source and see if it makes sense. And you can see nothing but green pretty much from this angle. So that's a good one. Now, real quick, last thing I want to talk about is the OSL checklist. And in this, we're going to be able to talk about some things, some questions to ask yourself if you want to do OSL. So, the first question on your checklist should be, will the object illuminate something important on the model? In other words, is the light source in a good position? So a lot of times, if you see a lantern on a model or a torch or something like that, you're going to be tempted to do OSL, right? That's the first question I get when I put up a model on my stream where there's something that I could do OSL with. Everybody's like, are you going to do OSL on that? But sometimes the lantern, the torch, the gemstone, the whatever is in a bad place, right? Sometimes, like we were working on the pack turtle and his handler from Reaper. The lantern is hung off the turtle's rear. If we made that the light source, we wouldn't even get the handler in it, and the turtle's face wouldn't get hit at all. So that would be a bad light source placement, right? So ask yourself if the thing that you're using to illuminate the area is in a good place. In many cases with torch models, it's going to be fine because the torch is usually held up and in the front. But beware, because as you can see with this guy, the torch is actually mostly lighting behind. It just barely hits his face, and I actually had to kind of push it a little bit, and it's probably a little unrealistic with the placement if you really look hard at it. The only way I could do it is because fire moves. I was like, all right, well, and I wanted his face to get hit. But this torch is actually pretty far back, and if I had really strictly, like if it was a lantern, it wouldn't have hit his face, and it would have been a poor subject for OSL at that point, because the interest on a model is usually like face, weaponry, but it's usually face and arms. What are they doing? And so if you can't illuminate the face, that can be a real hard sell on a miniature. So the best ones that I've got are going to illuminate the face, the important part of the model. That's why you'll see me do OSL a lot on models where the torch is held up, and it's why David uses these models, these little Pathfinder goblins with the torches, That's why he uses these for this OSL class, because it's the best case scenario. Snack was a little bit of an exception, at least because she's not a human, she's a snake, and she has a snout. That meant that the light, which is over her head, still hit her face. But if she had been a human, that light is pretty far back. And if her face was hidden within the hood, it wouldn't have hit that, right? This is a fireball. I mean, maybe I could bring some of it in, but it's very much kind of a question mark there as far as, you know, whether this would be a good position if this was a human model. Second is the area that you want to be glowing in deep shadow. So I get this a lot with monsters with deep set eyes and open mouths, like dragons. So the problem with doing OSL in a dragon's mouth, and we're just going to use Wolfie for this, but let me hold Wolfie up. Can you see something about his mouth? It's in shadow, isn't it? Like, there's shadows naturally cast when I hold him up with the light in the way that I would if I were looking at the model. All of this is just a cast shadow. And that means that you're not going to be able to do OSL in it. If you do, it will fail, because no matter how bright you paint this mouth, you're only going to see the tongue. Everything else, that bright color is going to be in a natural shadow, and everybody looking at it would have to tilt the model almost upside down to see it. So when you've got a monster with an open mouth, look at it in the lighting that you would maybe look at the miniature in normally if you were just going to take a look at it. See how much of the mouth is in shadow and plan accordingly. If a lot of it is in shadow, it's a poor candidate for OSL as far as making the interior of the mouth glowing. If it is really wide open and you can see the majority of like the tongue and back into the back of the mouth, then maybe you can do the glowing mouth trick on it with OSL. Otherwise, the only way to do that would be to run an LED into the monster from some angle and make it actually light up. The other thing is eyes, as I mentioned, dragon here. I managed to get away with it with dragon because his eyes are actually not very deep set. The scales kind of angle out as they go up and down, so there is room here for the light to get. I have painted monsters where they have very deep set eyes, where again, when I look at the model in normal lighting, the eye is in shadow. And when you see that, if you see an eye that's so deep set that it just looks like a pit, that's where you get into the cannot do OSL very easily. And Troll here is a great example. He's bent over, and when I look at him in a normal way, you can see, even though I've painted the eyes that bright orange color, but do you see they're still in shadow? So if I had tried to do OSL with this, it would fail because it's just going to look wrong because everything's going to be in shadow. It's not going to be able to be bright enough to be called OSL. Now, there is an exception here, and that is if you're trying to do an underlighting effect from below. And actually, let's talk about the Alchemist here and about one of David's other models. If you're just producing a model to be photographed, you can get away with this. Now, Alchemist looks great from this angle, but if I actually tilt him at all, the effect doesn't work anymore. See? And you guys probably noticed this when I brought this model up. But when I have him flat where the light is shining directly down on him, and I'm not really looking at him from that angle, from the right angle here. I'm just making him, look at the camera. So here he's perfect. But if I'm looking at him from my normal angle, you see how you start to lose all the effect here then, because this is in a deep shadow. So David has painted it really well, and it photos great, and it looks great if you tilt the model, or if you're looking at the model from a camera where you can shine it down at the same angle, or if you have a light behind you. Anything that is going to fill light, these shadows makes this model look great. But this is very difficult to do and have it look good. Obviously, he's pulled it off because he's a master. But again, from some angles, it does not read. Another one of his models that's like that is he did this one there. So again, this one works. He's got a red light coming from below. Can you do this? Absolutely. And when you tilt it correctly, it looks amazing. And when you've got a fill light, like I have a light that's shining pretty directly down, it's not quite picking up the eyes. There we go. So if I tilt it even more, so if you've got the light that's shining into all the area to illuminate the shadows, then you can see the effect, right? and it's really cool. And if you photograph it, it's really cool. But if you are looking at it in your hand, at first you're not going to get the full effect because the shadows are going to be very strong, especially up here with this overhanging helmet. So it definitely is an effect you can do. Just remember that it's only going to show up at a certain angle in most lights. So again, this is a case where you know the rule to break it. You can do it. It's just difficult and it doesn't always come off. All right, and then the last one, we're going to talk more about this next time, but are you painting the model as if it's in dim light? Again, if you're trying to paint a model in sunlight, as both of those models from David were, then it's going to be harder to project the OSL because you're competing with sunlight. He gets to do it because he's doing underlighting in both those models, so he's taking advantage of a shadow to make another light source, right? But otherwise, if you want OSL to look good, setting it in a dim light setting with lots of shadows where the rest of the model is in shadow, doesn't mean you don't paint it, right? Just means that it's in shadow, is probably the way to get the best effect, right? The most stunning effect. If you think back to the OSL that you really like, that you've seen on models, think about the ones that have really made you go, wow. Most of them are painted as if it's a night scene, or at least in dusk or dark, partial darkness, right? So, all right. I'm going to stop talking. This was a really long video. Apologies for that, but we'll wrap it up now. Next time I'm going to talk about shadows and painting shadow colors and like how shadows are structured. And then beyond that, we're going to go into some actual lessons in the coming months on how I paint OSL. Again, there's going to be so many ways to do it. Definitely check out other painters. I know there's amazing people out there who are doing lessons on this. But if you like my style, I'm going to show you how I do it, and then you can decide if you want to try it or not. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Remember, I have a Patreon. I'm going to be doing a PDF with lots of pictures of all these models in it for the $2 tier, patreon.com/paintingbig. Otherwise, I'm going to see you next month, all right, for shadows. Thanks so much. This is Anne signing off.